Hey there! How's everybody doing? Happy Monday. Let's see. Anything interesting hit the news today? Wish I'd take my own advice and just stop reading it. But yeah. So, today is the first of my August recordings, and as a reminder, if you have any intention of doing your mail-in voting, you should send back your forms, especially if you're in Massachusetts. The deadline is August 26th. Mine went in the mail today. So yeah, there's my PSA for today. And let's see here. Part 2 of Chapter 7, Parallel Lines. We were told that Dad was sick and would be in the hospital for a few weeks. We were also told that he had to give up his apartment. Apparently, the landlord wanted to rent the place to somebody else. Fritz and I went to pack up clothes, games, and other odds and ends we'd left behind, and when we arrived, the place was almost completely empty. The tanks were gone, the snakes were gone. I never found out what happened to them. When Dad returned from wherever he had been, the hospital or rehab, he moved into my grandparents' attic. It was a temporary arrangement, and no effort was made to turn it into a proper living space. All of the storage boxes and old toys, including the vintage fire engine, crane, and dump truck my grandmother had hidden all of those years ago, had simply been pushed to one end of the attic, and a cot set up in the cleared space at the other. Dad put his portable 6-inch black and white television on his old National Guard trunk beneath the dormered window. When Fritz and I visited him, we camped out on the floor next to his cot, and the three of us watched an endless stream of old movies such as Tora, 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 and It's a Mad, 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 Mad World. I'm just going to interject here and say I've never heard of either of those films. But, hey, your mileage may vary. When he was well enough to come downstairs, Dad joined us on Sundays for the weekly Abbott and Costello movie on WPIX. After a month or two, my grandfather told Dad there was a vacancy in Sunnyside Towers, a building my grandfather had bought in 1968, a one-bedroom apartment on the top floor. As Dad was preparing to move to Sunnyside, Mary Ann, with the help of a $600 loan, was getting ready to start her studies at Hofstra Law School. Although not her first choice, Hofstra was only a 10-minute drive from Jamaica Estates, close enough that she could still take my cousin David to school in the morning and pick him up in the afternoon. Going back to school was a long-deferred dream. She had hoped that becoming a lawyer would give her the financial wherewithal to leave her husband someday. Their situation had become increasingly dire over the years. The parking lot attendant job that his father-in-law had given him was a humiliation from which he hadn't recovered. Over the years, David had lashed out at his wife from time to time, particularly when he was drunk. He had brandished a gun at her and threatened her with a knife more than once while their young son slept in the next room. Mary Ann's move toward independence sent her husband even further over the edge, and after she returned home from her first day of law school, her husband, in a fit of rage, threw their 13-year-old son out of the apartment. Mary Ann took him to the house, and they spent the night there. David Desmond Sr. cleaned out their meager joint savings account and left town. So, did him a favor, from everything I can tell here. Wow, they just attract some wonderful people, huh? When the whole family was together, we spent most of our time in the library, a room without books, until Donald's ghost-written The Art of the Deal was published in 1987. The bookshelves were used instead to display wedding photos and portraits. The wall across from the bay window overlooking the backyard was dominated by a studio portrait of the 5 siblings taken when they were adults that had replaced an earlier version of the 5 in similar poses taken when Freddy was 14. I'm not going to lie, guys. I have mocked her for her use of commas through a lot of this book, but there was not a single comma in that entire sentence. Yeah. Let me take that one more time just to prove a point. The bookshelves were used instead to display wedding photos and portraits. The wall across from the bay window overlooking the backyard was dominated by a studio portrait of the 5 siblings taken when they were adults that had replaced an earlier version of the 5 in similar poses taken when Freddy was 14. The only non-studio photographs in the room were a black and white shot of my grandmother, looking regal and condescending in her hat and fur stole, as she and my aunts, young girls at the time, descended the stairs to the tarmac in Stornoway on the Isle of Lewis, where Gam had been born, and one of Donald, in New York Military Academy dress uniform, leading the school contingent in the New York City Columbus Day Parade. There were 2 love seats upholstered in dark blue and green vinyl against the walls, and 1 large chair in front of the TV, a spot the kids fought over regularly. My grandfather, dressed in his 3-piece suit and tie, sat on the love seat nearest the heavy pine phone table by the door, his feet planted squarely on the ground. Every Saturday, if we weren't in Sunnyside with Dad, Fritz and I rode our bikes down to Highland Avenue and along the back streets of Jamaica Estates to the house to hang out with our cousin David. Or rather, Fritz and David hung out, and I followed them around, trying to keep up. Gam sat with Mary Ann and Elizabeth whenever they visited at a small sky blue formica table with stainless steel edging that looked as though it came straight out of 1950s. Just past it, there was a dark pantry the size of a walk-in closet with a little desk where Gam kept her shopping list, receipts, and bills. Marie, the long-suffering housekeeper, often hid there, listening to her portable radio, and on rainy or cold days when David, Fritz, and I were confined to the house, we drove her crazy. On the other side of the pantry, a swinging door led to the dining room. We used the loop that ran from the back door hallway past the kitchen, through the foyer, around to the dining room, through the pantry, and back to the kitchen as our personal racetrack, chasing one another, wiping out, screaming, gaining speed, one of us invariably banging into a piece of furniture. Between the refrigerator and the pantry door, Gam generally gave us free rein, but when she was in the kitchen, she would lose her patience and yell at us to stop. She threatened us with a wooden spoon if we ignored her. The sound of the drawer opening was enough to give us pause. But if we were stupid enough to keep running around her and making a racket, the spoon came out, and whoever was closest at hand got whacked. Liz did her part to slow us down by grabbing our hair as we passed. After that, Fritz, David, and I usually ran to the basement. Adults passed through only on their way to the laundry room or the garage, so we were free to be loud and to kick around the soccer ball or take turns riding up and down or fighting over Gam's electric stair lift. We spent most of our time in the open space at the far end with all the lights on. With the exception of my grandfather's life-size wooden Indian chief statue that were with the exception of my grandfather's life-size wooden Indian chief statues, multiples, not just one, but multiples. Wow. We lined up against the far wall like sarcophagi. It was a pretty typical basement. Drop ceilings with fluorescent lighting, white and black linoleum tile, and an upright piano that stood largely ignored because it was so badly out of tune it wasn't even worth playing. Donald's marching hat with the huge plume that he had worn during the color guard at NYMA stood on top of it. Sometimes I put it on, though it slid down to the bridge of my nose and fastened the strap beneath my chin. When I was down there by myself, the basement, half illuminated, the wooden Indian statues standing sentinel in the shadows, became a weirdly exotic space. Across from the stairs, a huge mahogany bar, fully stocked with bar stools, dusty glasses, and a working sink, but no alcohol, had been built in the corner, an anomaly in a house built by a man who didn't drink. A large oil painting of a black singer with beautiful full lips and generous swaying hips hung on the wall behind it. Wearing a curve-hugging gold and yellow dress with ruffles, she stood at the microphone, mouth open, hand extended. A jazz band made up entirely of black men, dressed in white dinner jackets and black bow ties, played behind her. The brasses glowed, the woodwinds glistened, the clarinetist, a sparkle in his eye, looked straight out at me. I would stand behind the bar, towel slung over my shoulder, whipping up drinks for my imaginary customers, or I would sit on one of the bar stools, the only patron, dreaming myself inside that painting. Our Uncle Rob, who wasn't that much older than we were and seemed more like a sibling than an uncle, played soccer with us in the backyard whenever he came out of the city. We played hard and on hot days made frequent trips to the kitchen for a can of Coke or a grape juice. Rob would often grab a block of Philadelphia cream cheese. Leaning against the refrigerator, he'd peel back the foil and eat the cream cheese as if it were a candy bar, then wash it down with soda. Rob was a very good soccer player, and I tried to keep up with the boys, but it sometimes felt as though he used me for target practice. When Donald was at the house, we mostly threw a baseball or football around. He had played baseball at New York Military Academy and was even less likely to pull his punches than Rob. He saw no reason to throw the ball any more gently just because his niece and nephews were 6 or 9 or 11. When I did manage to catch the ball he threw at me, the report of it against my leather glove reverberated off the brick retaining wall like a shot. Even with little kids, Donald had to be the winner. Only the most dedicated optimist could have lived in Sunnyside Towers without losing hope. There was no doorman, and the plastic plants and flowers that filled the 2 large planters on either side of the plexiglass front door were perpetually coated in a thin film of dust. Our 6th-floor hallway reeked of stale cigarette smoke. The dank carpet was a soulless shade of seal gray. The indifferent overhead lighting hid nothing. The height of my father's lifestyle had been when he and my mom had lived in their 1-bedroom near Sutton Place right after they were married. During that year, they had spent their evenings going to Copacabana with friends and flying to Bohemia on the weekends. It had been all downhill from there, a trajectory that mirrored that of Donald, whose own lifestyle became more extravagant as the years passed. Donald had already been living in Manhattan when he married Ivana. After the wedding, they lived in a 2-bedroom apartment on 5th Avenue, then an 8-bedroom apartment also on 5th Avenue. Within 5 years, they were living in a $10 million penthouse triplex in Trump Tower, all while Donald was still effectively on my grandfather's payroll. My grandfather created Midland Associates in the 1960s to benefit his children, each of whom was given 15% ownership in 8 buildings, one of which was Sunnyside Towers. The express purpose of this apparently quasi-legal, if not outright fraudulent transfer of wealth was to avoid paying the lion's share of gift taxes that would have been assessed if it had been an above-board transaction. I don't know if Dad knew that he owned part of the building he lived now in, but in 1973, his share of it would have been worth about $380,000, or $2.2 million in today's dollars. He seemed to have no apparent access to any of the money. His boats and planes were gone. His Mustang and Jaguar were gone. He still had his FCT vanity plate, but now they were attached to a beat-up Ford LTD. Whatever wealth my father had was, by then, entirely theoretical. Either his access to the trust funds had been blocked, or he had stopped thinking he had any right to his own money. Thwarted one way or the other, he was at his father's mercy. Dad and I were watching a Mets game on television when the intercom buzzed. Dad looked surprised and went to answer. I didn't hear who was calling from the lobby, but I heard my father say, "Shit," under his breath. We'd been having a laid-back afternoon, but Dad seemed tense now. "Donald's coming up for a couple of minutes," he told me. "Why?" "No idea." He seemed annoyed, which was unusual for him. Dad tucked his shirt in and opened the door as soon as the bell rang. He took a couple of steps back to let his brother pass. Donald was wearing a 3-piece suit and shiny shoes and carrying a thick manila envelope wrapped in several wide rubber bands. He walked into the living room. "Hi, honey bunch," he said when he saw me. I waved at him. Donald turned back to my dad and said, "Jesus, Freddy." As he looked around disdainfully, my father let it slide. Donald tossed the envelope into the coffee table and said, "Dad needs you to sign these and then bring them to Brooklyn." "Today?" "Yeah, why? You busy?" "You take it to him?" "I can't. I'm on my way to the city to look at some properties that are in foreclosure. It's a fantastic time to take advantage of losers who bought at the height of this market." Freddy never would have dared develop his own projects outside of Brooklyn. A few years earlier, on a weekend trip to the Poconos, as he and Linda had driven past row after row of condemned building on either side of the Cross Bronx Expressway, she pointed out that he could start his own business and renovate buildings in the Bronx. No way I could go against Dad, Freddy had said. It's all about Brooklyn for him. He'd never go for it. Now Donald looked out the window and said, Dad's going to need somebody in Brooklyn. You should go back. And do what exactly? Dad scoffed. I don't know. Whatever you used to do. I had your job. In the uncomfortable silence, Donald looked at his watch. My driver's waiting downstairs. Get this to Dad by 4 o'clock, okay? After Donald left, Dad sat on the couch next to me and lit a cigarette. So, kiddo, he said, want to take a ride to Brooklyn? When we visited the office, Dad made the rounds on his way to Amy Lucerin, my grandfather's secretary and gatekeeper, and also my godmother, whose desk stood right outside of her boss's door. Aunt Amy clearly adored the man she called my Freddy. My grandfather's private office was a square room with low lighting, its walls covered with plaques and framed certificates, a lot of wooden busts of Indian chiefs in full headdresses scattered about. I sat behind his desk and chose from what seemed an endless supply of blue flare markers and the same thick pads of cheap scratch paper he had at the house, writing notes and drawing until it was time to go to lunch. When I was left alone, I spun wildly in his chair. My grandfather always took us to eat at Gargulo's, a formal restaurant with crisp cloth napkins and tablecloths, where he went almost every day. The differential waiters knew him, always called him Mr. Trump, pulled out his chair, and generally fussed over him throughout the meal. It was better when Aunt Amy or somebody else from the office joined us because it took the pressure off Dad. He and my grandfather had little left to say to each other. It didn't happen often that Donald was at the office at the same time we were, but it was much worse when we crossed paths. He acted as though he owned the place, which my grandfather seemed not only to encourage but to enjoy. My grandfather was transformed in Donald's presence. In 1973, the Department of Justice Civil Rights Division sued Donald and my grandfather for violating the 1968 Fair Housing Act by refusing to rent to Daesh forts, as my grandfather put it. It was one of the largest federal housing discrimination suits ever brought, and the notorious attorney Roy Cohn offered to help. Donald and Cohn had crossed paths at Le Club, a swanky members-only restaurant and disco on East 55th Street that was frequented by Vanderbilts and Kennedys, an array of international celebrities and minor royalty. Cohn was more than a decade removed from his disastrous involvement in Joseph McCarthy's failed anti-communist crusade. He had been forced to resign from his position as the senator's chief counsel, but not until he wrecked the lives and careers of dozens of men because of their alleged homosexuality and or ties to communism. Like many men of his vicious temperament and with his influential connections, Cohn was subject to no rules. Embraced by a certain segment of the New York elite and hired by a diverse pool of clients such as Rupert Murdoch, John Gotti, Alan Dershowitz, and the Roman Catholic Archdiocese of New York, Cohn entered private practice back in New York City, where he'd grown up. Over the ensuing years, he became very rich, very successful, and very powerful. Though Cohn was flashy where Fred was conservative and loud where Fred was taciturn, the differences between them were really of degree, not kind. Cohn's cruelty and hypocrisy were more public, but Fred had, in the intimate context of his family, also mastered those arts. Fred had also primed Donald to be drawn to men such as Cohn, as he would later be drawn to authoritarians such as Vladimir Putin and Kim Jong-un, or anyone else really, with a willingness to flatter and power to enrich him. Cohn recommended that Trump management file a countersuit against the Justice Department for $100 million over what he alleged were the government's false and misleading statements about his clients. The maneuver was simultaneously absurd, flashy, and effective, at least in terms of the publicity it garnered. It was the first time that Donald, at 27, had landed on a newspaper's front page, and although the countersuit would be tossed out of court, Trump management settled the case. There was no admission of wrongdoing, but they did have to change their rental practices to avoid discrimination. Even so, both Cohn and Donald considered it a win because of all the press coverage. When Donald hitched his fortunes to the likes of Roy Cohn, is it Cohn? Cohn? Cohn. Again, pronunciation help in the comments. Cohn. And I know I've heard it on the news, but yeah. When Donald hitched his fortunes to the likes of Roy Cohn, the only thing he had going for him were Fred's largesse and a carefully cultivated but delusional belief in his own brilliance and superiority. Ironically, the defenses he had developed as a young child to protect himself against the indifferences, fear, and neglect that had defined his early years, along with his being forced to watch the abuse of Freddy, primed him to develop what his older brother clearly lacked: the ability to be a killer, and proxy his father required. There's no way to know precisely when Fred started to notice Donald, but I suspect it was after he shipped his son off to military school. Donald seemed amenable to his father's exhortations to be tough, a killer, and he proved his worth by bragging about the random beatings he received from the upperclassmen or pretending not to care about his exile from home. Fred's growing confidence in Donald created a bond between them and an unshakable self-confidence in Donald. After all, the most important person in the family, the only one whose opinion mattered, was finally showing him favor, and unlike Freddy, the attention Donald received from his father was positive. After college, when Donald was finally out in the world using his father's connections to make more connections, and using his father's money to create his image as a burgeoning master of the universe, Fred knew that anything his son got credit for would redound to his own benefit. After all, if Donald was embraced as an up-and-coming dealmaker, that was entirely to the credit of Fred Trump, even if Fred was the only person who knew it. In interviews in the early 1980s, Fred claimed that Donald's success had far exceeded his own. "I gave Donald free rein," he said. "He had great visions, and everything he touches seems to turn to gold. Donald is the smartest person I know." None of that was true, and Fred must have known that a decade before he said it. After Steeplechase, Fred had lost a lot of ground. If he wanted to expand the reach of his empire, he would need a new playing field and a surrogate. He needed Donald to go out in the world and create the brand. It hadn't taken Fred long to realize that his profligate middle son wasn't suited to the unglamorous, tightly budgeted, and highly regimented routine of running rental properties. But with his father's backing, maybe he could use his hubris and shamelessness to make the push into Manhattan. Fred wasn't living vicariously. He was intimately involved in all aspects of Donald's early forays into the Manhattan market. Getting things done behind the scenes while Donald played to the crowd up front, Fred made it possible for Donald to play a role that fulfilled his own desire for recognition while allowing his son to garner the reputation as a Manhattan developer that Fred had always aspired to be. Fred would never get the public recognition, but it was enough for him to know that the opportunities Donald had to make his mark and promote himself would never have materialized without him. The success and the acclaim were due to Fred and his vast wealth. Any story about Donald was really a story about Fred. Fred also knew that if that secret was uncovered, the ruse would fall apart. In retrospect, Fred was the puppeteer, but he couldn't be seen to be pulling his son's strings. It's not that Fred was overlooking Donald's incompetence as a businessman. He knew he had more than enough talent in that arena for both of them. Fred was willing to stake millions of dollars on his son because he believed he could leverage the skills Donald did have as a savant of self-promotion, shameless liar, marketer, and builder of brands. To achieve the one thing that had always eluded him, a level of fame that matched his ego and satisfied his ambition in a way money alone never could. When things turned south in the late 1980s, Fred could no longer separate himself from his son's brutal ineptitude. The father had no choice but to stay invested. His monster had been set free. All he could do was mitigate the damage, keep the cash flowing, and find somebody else to blame. Over the next 2 years, Dad became more taciturn, more grim, and if possible, thinner. The apartment in Sunnyside Towers was gray. Gray because of the northwest exposure, gray from the unending clouds of cigarette smoke, gray because of his terrible moods. There were mornings when he barely managed to get out of bed, let alone spend a whole day with us. Sometimes he was hungover, sometimes he was depressed. If we didn't have anything scheduled, Dad often made an excuse to leave us alone, saying he had to work or run errands for Gam. Once Dad told us he had a job managing paper boys. I'd briefly had a paper route, and as far as I could tell, that meant he was the guy who handed out the papers to the delivery kids from the trunk of his car, then collected the cash from them when they'd finished their routes. He told me once that he made $100 a day, which seemed like an enormous sum to me. One evening, we were at the apartment having dinner with Dad's girlfriend, Johanna. I preferred it when she wasn't there. Something about her was off-putting. She didn't connect or even try to with me and Fritz. It was bad enough that she said things like, "Freddy, light me a fag," considering she wasn't British, but Dad started saying them too. We just finished eating when I started to recount the adventures I'd had with my mother at the bank that afternoon. While she had waited in the very long line, I had stood at one of the counters and filled out the deposit slips with all sorts of aliases and wild sums of money I planned to withdraw in order to fund various schemes. I could barely contain how funny I thought the whole thing was. But as I told them about the secret identities, the secret withdrawals of cash, and my fiendish plots to disperse them, Dad got a wary look in his eyes. "Does Mr. Tosti know about this?" he asked. If I'd been paying closer attention, I might have known to stop, but I thought he was kidding, so I kept telling my story. Dad got increasingly agitated, leaned forward, and pointed his finger at me. "What did you do?" As moody as my father could be, I'd rarely seen him so angry, and I'd almost never heard him raise his voice. I was confused and tried to retrace my narrative back to the point where he had started to think I'd done something wrong. But there was no such point, and my explanation about what had really happened only agitated him further. "If Mr. Tosti finds out about this, I'm going to be in trouble with your grandfather." Johanna put her hand on Dad's arm as if to draw attention away from me. "Freddy, it's nothing." "What do you mean, nothing? This is really goddamn serious." I flinched at the curse word. At that point, both Johanna and I knew there was no talking him down. He was drunk and trapped in some old narrative. I tried to explain it to him to steady him, but he was too far gone, and I was only 8. In the summer of 1975, Donald gave a press conference during which he presented a rendering of the architect's plans for the Grand Hyatt, as if he'd already won the contract to replace the old Commodore Hotel next door to Grand Central Terminal on 42nd Street. The media printed his claims as fact. That same summer, just before Fritz and I were scheduled to leave for camp, Dad had told Mom that he had some news. She invited him to dinner. I answered the door when Dad rang the bell. He was wearing what he always wore, black slacks and a white dress shirt. But his clothes were crisp and his hair was slicked back. I had never seen him look so handsome. While Mom tossed the salad, Dad grilled the steak on our small terrace. When the food was ready, we sat at the small table next to the terrace, propping the door open so the mild summer breeze could blow in. We drank water and iced tea. "I'm moving to West Palm Beach at the end of the summer," he told us. "I found a great apartment on the Intracoastal with a dock in the back." He already had a boat picked out, and when we visited, he'd take us fishing and water skiing. As he spoke, he seemed happy and confident and relieved. All of us knew it was the right decision. For the first time in a long time, we felt hope. All right, folks, that does it for tonight. Like I said earlier, happy Monday. Stay sane. I think it's 92 days to the election. So let's keep that in our sights. And, I don't know, try and avoid the news. Peace out.